I have to show you my favorite page, though. So here it is, the heliocentric system. And look how he's arranged his writing around it. He really had a sense of beauty and proportion.
Hi, I'm Nitzan.
And I'm Adam, and this is Stories from the East and West.
Today's episode is about an astronomer from the 16th century who became obsessed with trying to figure out what exactly was going on up in the night sky, and ended up creating a whole new model of the universe.
Keep listening to find out how Copernicus came to this radical conclusion and completely changed how people saw the world.
Coming up on Stories from the East and West.
Zlin, Praha, Warszawa, Madrid, London, Paris, New York, Casablanca.
Where you see a kind of totality of the human presence.
Absolutely. That is exactly.
Все благоприятствовало, когда здесь остался. И работать,
Tak jak my w życiu, nigdy do końca nie ma odpowiedzi i nie będzie. To jest taki dzieło.
Stories from the Eastern West.
Mikołaj Kopernik był synem kupca. I gdyby nie śmierć ojca, a ojciec jego zmarł, kiedy Kopernik miał...
Nicholas Copernicus was the son of a merchant. If it hadn't been for the death of his father, who died when he was 10 years old, then the history books would have mentioned two Nicholas Copernicuses who lived in Toruń, because his father had the same name, and that would be that.
Gdzieś w Toruniu i tak by zostało.
That's Małgorzata Czupajło, educator at the Nicholas Copernicus Museum in Frombork and manager of the Astronomical Park.
Natomiast fakt śmierci ojca...
However, the death of his father meant that his uncle, Lukas Watzenrode, took over the care of Copernicus, his mother, and his siblings. Lukas Watzenrode had a career in the Roman Catholic Church, and in time he became the Bishop of Warmia. And Frombork, where we are speaking today, is the capital of the Warmian bishopric.
These days, the Warmia region makes up one half of the Warmian-Mazurian voivodeship in northern Poland, but back then it was a semi-autonomous monastic state, ruled by a bishop and under the Polish crown.
Copernicus's uncle wasn't Bishop of Warmia yet, but was already planning for his bright nephew to follow in his footsteps.
So Watzenrode sent him to his alma mater, the Krakow Academy, where he was supposed to study Latin, canon law and mathematics, things that would be useful for his future career.
However, Krakow was also known for its advanced lectures in natural sciences, and, crucially for our story, astronomy.
W tamtym czasie Akademia Krakowska słynęła...
At the time, the Krakow Academy was renowned for its science faculty and excellent lectures in astronomy, which students from all over Europe came to attend.
Do Krakowa przybywali studenci z całej Europy.
It was there that Copernicus got the astronomy bug.
Połknął tego bakcyla astronomii.
However, the version of the universe being taught in the late 1400s was markedly different from what we think of as obvious today. Firstly, the greatest minds in science were pretty much in agreement that the Earth was in the very center of the universe and that the Sun, and everything else in the sky, orbited the Earth each day.
This is known as the geocentric model, and it had gone pretty much unchallenged since being established by the great classical scientist Ptolemy, who had died over 1,000 years earlier.
So the prevailing worldview was the common sense view that the Earth is stationary. I mean, it certainly doesn't feel like it's moving to anybody.
This is Deva Sobel, science history writer and author of A More Perfect Heaven, How Copernicus Revolutionized the Cosmos.
We all know now that it does move, but we know because we have been told. If you had to figure it out for yourself, it's really not obvious.
First of all, why would a big, heavy, rocky body rotate that fast? And if the Earth is rotating, then why wouldn't you have this wind rushing over the horizon?
And this is Dr. Carl Garling, science historian at the American University in Cairo.
How are birds able to fly? Why, if you throw a rock in the air, doesn't it whoosh off in one direction or something like that?
It's much easier to think that the stars wheel around every night and the planets move around, but that the Earth is motionless.
Even though the geocentric theory was pretty much unquestioned at the Krakow Academy and other universities across Europe, it was also very bad at predicting the future positions of the planets.
It also had to use quite bizarre mathematical models to explain why certain planets like Mars seemed to suddenly stop and change direction.
Astronomia tamtego czasu to przede wszystkim matematyka.
Astronomy in those days was, above all, mathematics, because the idea was to determine the positions of the planets in the sky and then calculate where they were supposed to be later on, according to theory.
As moderns, we think of astronomy as pictures from spacecraft. You know, all of us know what the surface of the moon or the surface of Mars look like because we have these close-up pictures. Whereas astronomy at the time of Copernicus is much more about the movements of dots in the sky.
The telescope wouldn't be invented for another 100 years, so the astronomers of the time had nothing but rudimentary tools and the naked eye at their disposal in trying to figure out what was really going on up there.
At this point, the young Copernicus had no reason to question the existing geocentric model he was being taught. Besides, he wasn't really supposed to be studying astronomy. He was supposed to be preparing for a career in the church, especially since his uncle had just become Bishop of Warmia.
W trakcie tych studiów Łukasz Wacenrode.
During these studies, Wacenrode arranged a position for him as a church canon in Frombork, which he accepted.
And so by the time he goes off for his studies in Italy, he's already got sort of this position back in Warmia, which is a sort of guaranteed income stream. And that's the path that he's on.
After 2 years in Krakow, his uncle sends him to Bologna in Italy. Where he had also studied in order to complete a degree in canon law. There, Copernicus comes across some of the brightest minds in all of Europe.
To jest czas renesansu, takiej burzy.
This is the time of the Renaissance. There was such an explosion of ideas, of what we would today call human consciousness. Copernicus came into contact with all of this. A fascination with the human being and the world. He studied all of the ancient theories of the structure of the universe and started to shape his own ideas.
Copernicus ends up meeting and befriending plenty of mathematicians and scientists, including the prominent Italian astronomer Domenico Maria Novara, who he studied under and later assisted.
It may seem strange to us today, but like many astronomers at the time, Novara was also a practicing astrologer and was tasked with writing the yearly almanac for the town of Bologna. Predictions and horoscope readings were an extremely popular preoccupation and were one of the ways astronomers could earn a decent living.
Perhaps because he already had a guaranteed income, Copernicus isn't recorded as having provided such services. But when it came time to return to Warmia and start working as a canon, he asked Wacenrod to be able to prolong his stay in Italy.
He was allowed to return for another 3 years in order to study medicine, which would be useful for the church back in Warmia, as well as finally finish his doctorate in canon law. But he still somehow found time to pursue his passions of astronomy and advanced mathematics.
He was extremely well educated and obviously a really brilliant, innovative person just because of the number of talents that he exhibited. He mastered all this mathematics. He spoke several languages. He was trained as a doctor.
At this point, now 30 years old and with his degrees in Italy completed, his uncle expected him to finally start helping out in Warmia. Wacenrod took on Copernicus as his private secretary with the expectation that this would propel him to a top-level position in the Warmian church, perhaps even bishop like himself.
But Copernicus was far more interested in astronomy and mathematics than a political career, and while he was still working for his uncle, he stumbled upon something that would change the world forever.
After mulling over the observations he and others had made of the sun and planets, his mathematical calculations told him that the only thing that actually made sense was to place the sun in the center of the universe and have the Earth orbit it, along with the rest of the planets.
But as to what led him to this idea, he never says. He said he felt that he had the freedom to to think about it, and this is what he came up with. My personal question about it all was, did he feel that he had actually experienced a divine revelation? I rather like that. Of course, I could never prove it, but it's the way I like to think of him. The earliest date of his idea, what the Copernicus scholars call the brief sketch, the earliest possible date for that is about 1510. So things were cooking in his head, and that was written as a letter to other mathematicians interested in such things, which was how scholars communicated at that time. They all had the Latin language in common, and there were no journals or places where they could publish their ideas. They wrote letters.
Ta teoria zaczynała być znana.
And so this theory started becoming better known. Because of this, he knew what kinds of reactions to expect. He knew that some were calling him a well-born scholar, determined to destroy the prevailing order of the world.
The reaction to his idea among the trusted scholars he shared it with was mixed. His close friend in the Varmian church, the canon Tidman Giza, was initially perplexed and worried about him.
So it wasn't that easy to write this down, to provide proof and release it into the world. For the rest of his life, he would make observations and gather evidence for his theory.
So, despite making a discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of the cosmos, Copernicus continued with his day job. This included traveling extensively with his uncle, who was both the spiritual and political leader of Warmia, to various local parliaments in neighboring Royal Prussia.
And at a certain point, Copernicus, whether by choice or whether just by appointment, rather than staying at the bishop's castle in Lidzbark-Warmiński, he moves back to Frombork. And there's been some speculation that maybe this was the point where he decided, no, I don't really want to, be in the political rat race. I just want to be a scholar and a sort of steady official.
So he had all this education, all these powerful connections. He certainly could have succeeded his uncle in that role, but he made it clear that that was not what he wanted.
So, was there a final dramatic confrontation over dinner between Copernicus and his uncle about his future?
Yes, that's a wonderful thought. I'm sorry, Uncle. I know you thought I could amount to a bishop, but instead, I've decided to become an astronomer, to focus on my studies. And and the outraged, I groomed you. You could have been bishop, you could have been cardinal, maybe even Pope Copernicus, and you want to study these stupid mathematical equations. Yes, it's interesting to imagine a conversation like that of the disappointed uncle and family protector about the bohemian scholar who hasn't lived up to his political ambitions. But we don't know.
But despite leaving the orbit of his uncle, Copernicus continued to have important roles in Warmia, at one point being the chancellor of the region, practicing as a doctor, and even organizing the defense of castles and sacred relics during conflicts with the Teutonic Knights.
Warmia, along with the rest of the Kingdom of Poland, were engaged in a war with the Teutonic Order between 1519 and 1521. Since the territory of the Teutonic Knights almost completely surrounded Warmia, it was first in the line of battle.
Copernicus was made responsible for organizing the defense of the important castle at Olsztyn, where during a siege he still found time to make observations.
He's busy organizing the defenses and pleading for people to send him cannons rather than just the arquebuses that he has. And at the same time, he seems to have literally built an observing instrument into one of the walls of the castle. You can still see pieces of it. And it seems to have been, it's a sort of dial for measuring, for taking solar measurements. We see the fact that he made these observations because he uses them in his book. It's kind of an interesting, reminder of life goes on even amidst wartime.
A peace treaty is signed with the Teutonic Order in 1521, and a few years later, Duke Albrecht abandons the crusading mission of the state, declaring the secular Duchy of East Prussia and paying homage to the Polish king.
To była ostatnia wojna z Krzyżakami.
That was the last war with the Teutonic Knights. From 1525 till the end of Copernicus's life, there were no more military conflicts in the region.
Copernicus is able to return to Frombork and finally spend more time making observations and working on his book, explaining the heliocentric model he had first proposed 10 years earlier.
Frombork is a peaceful town located on the Vistula Lagoon, and Copernicus would spend the rest of his life there.
It's not Paris, it's not Rome, but it's a substantial administrative center. And of course, at that time, a lot of the industry of the region is connected to the Vistula River and to the coast.
On the other hand, the geographic location of Frombork wasn't exactly favorable for making astronomical observations.
I mean, the weather's terrible. There's a fog off the river or the inlet there. He's very far north. So that puts him at a disadvantage, and he's aware of all of that. He says so in his writings.
He complains about not having been able to see Mercury very well from Frombork because of how far north he is.
However, on the days and nights when the weather was good, Copernicus would spend time at his personal observatory. It consisted of a leveled terrace near his residence and the wooden astronomical instruments he had built by himself.
To było instrumentarium.
These were instruments used by astronomers in ancient times. The triquetrum had been used by Ptolemy, and the spherical astrolabe also originates in that time period. Copernicus was the last astronomer to use these instruments.
So much of Copernicus's work is related to timekeeping in one fashion or another. It's calculating, it's comparing, okay, the moon or the planet Saturn was here on June 15th, 1521, and then at this time during the age of Ptolemy, it was at this position. And so what are the long-term patterns? If it's taken, an X number of rotations, how do you precisely calculate the average motions of these planetary bodies?
Natomiast znajdował czas na to, żeby poświęcić go.
But he did find time to make nighttime observations and to write down and prove his theory. The work was more or less in its completed form in the year 1533, with the theory worked out but not yet prepared for publication.
He had not published his idea and was working on it over a very long period of time, decades.
Być może nigdy by nie wydał. To wszystko się dzieje.
It is possible that he never would have published it. All of this is happening in the midst of turmoil across Europe. And here he is, proposing a theory that directly contradicts our instinctive understanding of the world.
Do dzisiaj w języku tak zostało, tak? To słońce po niebie się porusza, gwiazdy się poruszają.
Because we can all see that it's the sun that rises and sets each day. It's just obvious to us that it moves. And this has remained part of our language. The sun moves across the sky, the stars move, they rise and set.
Wschodzą i zachodzą.
Certainly Copernicus is concerned that he has a controversial idea, but it's not so much that this is a threat of heresy. His specific remarks are, people may think that this is ridiculous, people may criticize it, people may think it's crazy.
And so it's easy to understand why Copernicus would not want to publish this idea and be attacked. I mean, imagine today, he'd be on Twitter and there would just be trolls after him. So he just kept it quiet for as long as he could. And then this young visitor showed up and talked him into publishing, reversing the reluctance of a lifetime.
przyjechał do Fromborka Jerzy Joachim Retyk.
Georg Joachim Reticus, a mathematician from Wittenberg, arrived in Frombork and convinced him to do it, to get the manuscript ready for publication.
Because he was not making any effort to publish the book, even though people in his circle were encouraging him to do that. People like Tiedemann Gies, but he wasn't going there until Reticus arrived. And when you think of these two people, they could not have had less in common. The age difference was at least 30, 40 years. There were different religions, different background, different nationality, but they both had this consuming interest in astronomy.
He shows up in Frombork in 1539 and, sort of says, I've heard, I've traveled here because I heard of this work that you were doing. You're not getting any younger. The world has heard of this. We all want to see what it is. Write it all down on paper. Get it into print.
That whole aspect of the story still just astounds me. That he was allowed to stay, welcomed in. Copernicus actually instructed him in the theory, shared everything with him, and even agreed to let him publish the book.
The decision is made to publish it in Nuremberg with Johannes Petreius, who has by this time developed quite a reputation for publishing scholarly works. And Reticus carries the manuscript there, but it is famously the editing process is finished by a man by the name of Andreas Osiander, who was the pastor at the St. Lawrence Church, and added a preface to an anonymous, unsigned preface to the book saying, astronomers use models in order to predict the motions of the heavens, but they're not really a source for philosophical truth. And that's not the opinion of Copernicus, and that's not the opinion of Reticus. I think Osiander, to some extent, was actually also trying to sell the book. I mean, he was working with Petreius as an editor on this. He wasn't interested in trashing the book. He was sort of saying, yes, this may look controversial, but don't worry about it too much.
But anticipating possible trouble, Copernicus had already decided to dedicate his groundbreaking, or rather universe-breaking, book to the Pope Paul III.
Copernicus introduced this book with a letter to the Pope, where he wrote that there will be people who will accuse him of abandoning the faith and say that he's making things up and has no right to put such things into print.
By doing that, by saying, I'm not ashamed to show this to the highest authority in the church, that means that I am not a blasphemer. I'm not attacking the Bible. I am talking about mathematics and conclusions drawn from mathematics. I was never able to discover how Copernicus got permission to dedicate the book to the Pope. That's one of the more intriguing mysteries, to me, anyway.
There's a popular legend about Copernicus, long portrayed in paintings of him, that he held a copy of his book on the revolutions, the culmination of his life's work, in the hours just before his death. But the actual story is a bit different, as Małgorzata Czupajło explains.
Pół roku przed śmiercią doznał wylewu krwi do mózgu.
6 months before his death, he had a stroke. He's often portrayed on his deathbed with one hand placed on a book. And according to legend, and frankly it's a wonderful legend, the book is On the Revolutions.
To jest właśnie De Revolutionibus. Ale
But we know from historical sources that in the last 6 months of his life, he was no longer fully conscious and had lost his sight. We now know from a letter written by his friend Tiedemann Giese that although he saw initial prints of the first part of the book, he never saw the finished version while he was still fully conscious. Also, according to this legend, Copernicus crossed out the preface added by Osiander, as it went against his own conclusions.
It was long thought that at most maybe a few dozen people had read the initial printing of 400 copies of On the Revolutions. But in the 1970s, the historian Owen Gingrich began a mission to track down every surviving copy of the first edition.
In his research, what he discovered was everybody had read Copernicus. It was extremely popular. There were whole schools of thought. There were certain notations that got copied over into other people's books. So you could almost tell who knew whom at that time from the types of notations written into the copies.
But there was one problem. It seemed that a lot of scholars were ignoring the most important part of the book, the new heliocentric model of the universe that Copernicus was proposing. Or at least they didn't quite know what to make of it.
Do they really believe that the sun is the center of the cosmos, or do they still believe that the Earth is the center of the cosmos? Most of the time, you can't tell that from their annotations.
It took quite a long time before the world accepted his theory, and that included other scholars.
It's as though they just ignored the heliocentric idea.
They were interested in other aspects, technical aspects of the planetary model, of his estimates of the year length, of his comparisons of the angle of the ecliptic and things like that.
It turns out everyone, from astronomers to church officials to astrologers, found his calculations extremely useful.
The Catholic Church was able to accurately set the date of Easter, and astrologers were able to improve their tables and charts.
As an astrologer, you want to say that you're up on the latest science of astrology. Unlike my charlatan competitors, I have read the most up-to-date, most current stuff, and I can give you, the most modern, sophisticated models of astrology.
Overall, the publication of On the Revolutions was a massive step forward for scientific knowledge, and other astronomers, such as Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, continued the work of charting the movements of the sky with increasingly accurate instruments.
Then, almost 100 years later, the Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei was able to prove Copernicus was right once and for all. He was able to do this because of the invention of the telescope in the Netherlands in the early 1600s, initially as a practical tool for sailors.
Natomiast jako pierwszy w niebo spojrzał przez teleskop Galileusz.
However, it was Galileo who first pointed a telescope up at the sky in 1609. He became a leading proponent of Copernicus's theory, especially after he was the first to observe Jupiter and its moons. He saw that Jupiter's moons were these 4 tiny stars, and that they moved around, that every day their positions were different. And the Milky Way wasn't just a white globe, but made up of many separate stars. Because when you look at it through a telescope, you can see star after star. These were his first observations, and they led him to come out very strongly in support of Copernicus.
Even though Galileo was tried and placed under house arrest for the rest of his life for loudly espousing heliocentrism and contradicting the established model of the universe, by this time there was no turning back.
Exactly 360 years later, in 1969, human beings left their home planet for the first time and landed on another rocky object flying through space, the moon.
Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Plus 30 seconds.
Tower cleared.
Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
Also, if your daily horoscope ever turns out to be correct, you should probably thank the guy that made it possible by dedicating his life to putting the stars and planets exactly where they should be.
And by doing so, started a revolution.
This episode of Stories from the East and West was brought to you by Culture.pl, the flagship brand of the Adam Mickiewicz Institute. It was hosted by Nitzan Reisner and me, Adam Zulawski.
It was reported and written by Peter Wolodzko and scored by Wojciech Oleksiak. It was edited by Wojciech and Adam. Piotr would like to thank Małgorzata Czupajło, Deva Sobol, and Karol Gale for taking the time to talk to him.
If you're interested in learning more about Copernicus, the show notes have lots of links for you and can be found in your podcast app or on the Stories from the East and West website at sftew.com.
See you next month.
Bye.